thank you very much, Andy, for that really inspiring, thought-provoking set of remarks. And I really hope that we can build on the positivity and optimism with which you ended, because this is our opportunity with this great panel that I've got here to pick up on the question that you raised. How can we unlock that potential from the UK cities and regions? And what does the future of levelling up, what could it look like? And what does it mean for our local and regional innovation economies? So I'm McGuinness. I'm on the board at the Connected Places Catapult. I've also been working closely with 3CI on talking with the finance sector on how to unlock financing for net zero. Let me put in a plug for our session at 2:30, which might talk a little bit about private partnerships and how to unlock private finance. But you're really here now to listen to this great panel that we have, which is really well equipped to speak from the city's perspective. So we have Councillor Susan Aitken, leader of Glasgow City Council, and under your leadership, Susan, Glasgow hosted the COP in 2026, the Finance COP as I like to think of it. Glasgow's been named the Global Green City and European Capital of Sport for 2023. And you're an advisory board member of the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission, 3CI. And we have Baroness Blake, Judith Blake of Leeds, a peer in the House of Lords who serves on the opposition front bench as a shadow spokesperson for energy and net zero and business. And you had a session, I think, also on housing and local government, with the portfolio there.
That was a while ago.
Yeah. Yes. But you're, as a former leader of Leeds, inspirational leader of Leeds City Council, you're a friend and ally of local government. So in fact, we have two great local government leaders, past or present, with us. And then we have Stephen Jones, the director of Core Cities, which brings together the councils of the 11 major cities across the UK. And before leading that, Stephen, you spent 20 years in the civil service and were most recently director of the Cities and Local Growth Unit. So I think, welcome to all of you. I'm really looking forward to hearing your reflections on what Andy had to say. And thinking of that plea that he put in for a sequence of supercharged local growth strategies and a bottom-up approach, how can we get that going? I wonder what your reflection is on how we allocate public investment into public assets to boost the performance of city regions as part of that, or how we focus more on unlocking the conditions within regions for innovation to thrive. So how far is this a question of taking public money and putting it into public assets? How far nurturing the local conditions, or indeed both? A little reflection from each of you. And before you start, actually, can I just remind everybody to put any questions they want into Slido? I don't promise that we'll get there, but we'll try. Susan.
I think the first one of those, investing in public assets, is a condition for releasing the potential then of those assets. And the reality is that in many parts of the UK, we still live with public assets that are not of the quality that they need to be, that have either been degraded over time through a lack of investment or are just not up to scratch in comparison with our global competitors. I know that a lot of people have had issues with transport here this morning, for example. That's an obvious one that we probably all experience every day. I'm quite lucky. Glasgow has, in comparison to many other places, a fairly decent integrated public transport system, which I use every day, but I go to a city in mainland Europe and there's no comparison. They're just miles and miles ahead of us. There are whole swathes of post-industrial communities across the UK that still live with land which, before it is able to realise the potential that Andy quite rightly talked about in his presentation, needs to be made usable. Some of it is toxic because it's post-industrial, some of it presents an enormous flood risk. So that kind of investment, that kind of adaptive, resilience-based investment into our places is in itself enabling and unlocking for the potential to follow. So those have to happen simultaneously. It doesn't mean that we wait until all of that has been done, because there's potential there already that needs to be invested in. But it can't be a case that we just focus on the parts that are already delivering or have potential to deliver more and leave others to wither. That has to be a simultaneous approach. And at the moment, I'm not convinced that we've got that happening at the right kind of pace. In Glasgow, for example, the Glasgow City region, we were one of the 3 city regions in the UK that benefited from the Innovation Accelerator monies. We've had a very, very good experience of that. I'll maybe get an opportunity to talk a wee bit more about it later. But we still have massive deficits in infrastructure and in quality of place that will hold back our potential to deliver even more and to advance in genuinely inclusive growth that brings all of our population with us. So this very much has to be a two-sided coin with clear strategies for how they link into each other and how one feeds and actually creates the conditions and enables the opportunities for that inclusive growth to follow.
Thank you. Judith, any observations from you?
No, thank you, Susan. That was a very comprehensive answer, and I think the answer is both.
Yes.
And without both, we're just not going to get anywhere. I would love to stretch the title a bit to obviously talking about places, great places around the whole of the UK, but also people and all of that social capital that doesn't really get into the mainstream discussions about policy. I don't really like to describe people as assets, but of course they are. And without investing in their health, in their skills, on all of the other important aspects, then places are going to be held back. And we see the disparities between the regions. It is absolutely devastating, to be honest. I came down to Westminster 3 years ago, and sometimes I cannot believe the conversations and the lack of awareness of what actually is happening in our regions, the huge energy, the commitment to moving forward. We're not stuck in our ways, and a city like Leeds has never attracted, for example, Objective 1 funding. We're known as the 50-50 city. I think we voted to reform by 0.4%, for example. And so we never attracted the big funding. So way back from when I first became a councillor in the 1990s, we had to invest in partnerships in the local area. And it's through that experience and the success that Leeds has had that we've recognised just how important all of that capacity to build those relationships and to be allowed to get on with it. And, you know, from a local government perspective, you look at some of the barriers to development, for example, and you know if you unlocked a particular crossing or changed a road system, you could move things forward. But every small decision that you have to go back to Westminster for is just so destructive, so huge amount to do around that. But a word of caution, really, because we tend to frame the culture shift that's needed to really deliver in partnerships as between the public sector and between the private sector. Well, from experience, I would make no assumptions about the similarities in culture, for example, of the organisation around local authorities and, for example, the health service. I think some of the toughest work we've done in Leeds and now West Yorkshire is around bringing together integrated services around health. It's been a tough road and a long road, but it really has paid off. But ultimately, government, Westminster, different departments are at a different place in this, have to let go so that local areas can actually come up with their priorities based on what they know, what the capacity, the potential and give them some of the freedom to move forward. But the other really important aspect is around the getting away from the short-termism that we have now. And we're seeing that in the run-up to the general election now. Working around this space on a general election cycle is destructive. And I would like to pay tribute to Lord Kerslake, Bob Kerslake, a huge friend to all of us who set up the UK 2070 Commission. It's my huge privilege to be the vice chair and now the interim chair, in terms of choosing 2070 for a reason. It's going to take generational change to get to where we need to be. Let's all get together, get on that journey, and allow regions to develop their potential, which ultimately, of course, will allow UK PLC to fly.
Short-termism, also partisanship, I suppose, and one thing that I find very rewarding working with 3CI is seeing how cities from across the UK with different complexions can work together in the interests of a common goal. I take it from what you've just said that you would support Andy's call for a more ambitious devolution approach.
Completely. And one of my frustrations actually has been the whole story around Transport for the North. And when we first set it up, I think we proved, first of all, that across the North we get on with each other, which is a bit of a challenge to get across. Down in Westminster, they like to peddle the idea that we're all falling out with each other. We're able to prioritise based on sound economic information and data, which we brought in. And unfortunately, the way it's gone on, they've stripped back the delivery powers of Transport for the North, and it's a hugely missed opportunity from my point of view. But more devolution. But I think the regional dimension is something that the new government, whichever it is coming in, needs to actually think about scale. How we actually go out to the world and attract investment in. At the moment, I hate to say it, but when I visited China, Leeds was just a dot on the map and didn't even at that time have a good football team to things are changing to promote it. But you talked about the North, and whatever you think about the Northern Powerhouse, they got it. Particularly across the Middle East, they got the scale, the potential, the pipelines, the opportunities, and we've got to get back that enthusiasm, that ambition, and that real sense that, if we're just given the levers to do it, we can make an enormous difference, but we need to be allowed to get on with it.
And I have a question, and I will be coming to the other members of the panel, but I have a question specifically for you here. You mentioned the lack of awareness in central government of the capacity for change and the barriers being faced by local government and cities. How do we overcome those silos between local and central government so that we can unlock decision making and funding?
So, if I can just reference Labour policy going forward into the next election, a real recognition that the silo mentality in Westminster is a massive problem. There's a lot of protectionism in terms of this is my space, this is my budget. You can see why that's happened. It's also within departments as well. When I was responsible for education, you would get different bits of the education department who weren't speaking to each other. So the mission-led approach, actually looking at outcomes coming up and recognising that to deliver the priorities we need to deliver, it's across the piece. All departments need to come together and determine what their contribution can be, but hold the ring and have those conversations so everyone knows when things move forward. We've done it locally. It's possible to do it. It's empowering. There needs to be that culture shift in Westminster.
Thank you. And turning to you, Stephen, first of all, any reflections that you have on what you've heard from Andy and the other panellists?
Yeah, sure. So let me firstly just pick up on that last point from Judith. And my sort of experience of 20 years in Whitehall is you need the leadership to drive the collaboration and to break the silos, the kind of the default position of retreating into your particular area of expertise, your particular policy area, needs kind of a challenging from ministers, from Cabinet Office, from the Treasury. You need that kind of galvanising spirit to force that behaviour. There have been times in that 20 years when it existed. There have been times when it hasn't existed. The period in the last few years is one of the latter. And so I think the kind of, whether it's a missions-based approach or whether it's going back to, fusion doctrine that Mark Sedor was trying to do, or going back further to PSA targets of the last Labour government, there were various different mechanisms to galvanise and to drive that collaboration, I think is critical. Let me come then to Andy referenced the work that we as Core Cities did with the RSA last year on the Urban Futures Commission. And let me sort of unpack a little bit what I think, at its heart, it was quite a simple set of conclusions. It was, firstly, you need a plural group of leaders in a place to come together and work together. Marvin, in the previous session, was referencing it's not just a single individual, it is a group of leaders in the place working together. Then they need a collective plan of what does the economic future of our place look like? How is that going to be inclusive in a social way? How is it going to be respectful and regenerative of the environment? That plan needs, writing and galvanizing behind. And then you need, what are the assets and what are the investments and what are the policies and programs that sit underneath that plan? And some of those will be in a transport space, some of those will be in a skills space, some of those will be in a innovation space. But kind of being able to devise the particular propositions and then work out what is the balance of public and private money that you can deploy against those to kind of get those, to generate that investment and that growth that we need. And, some of the stark statistics that we identified in the Commission of kind of total public and private investment disparities was at the heart of why we have the productivity disparities, the health disparities, the growth disparities. If you actually don't put enough money in, you don't get enough out at the end. And I think the fact that within central London, sort of 10 times the amount of investment in public and private capital than you see in our other cities, and even greater disparities when you look at some of our smaller cities and towns, is sort of needs addressing. And that therefore needs to think about how does that financial system operate, some of which is how do you empower places and create that sort of the ability to have revenue streams you can leverage against. I think that is at the heart of the fiscal devolution debate. It's why, with Andy, I'm very attracted to the idea of looking at public sector land and the kind of the values that can accrue from that we're in a sort of slightly strange world where we're trying to convince the NHS and the Department and the Network Rail to get into the house building industry, as opposed to just saying, well, that's just the fact it's your public land in the NHS. It's not the NHS's land, it's the public sector's land. Let's use it for what the public sector needs it for if you're not using it for hospitals and GP surgeries. And so I think there's something about how do we sort of utilise the collective assets and maximise the value of them, and then have the revenue streams flowing locally. I think the other thing, I strongly agree on the point on we have a woeful property taxation system. We also have a very fragile and coming to an end transport taxation system. The future of fuel duty, the future of road duty is based on the combustion engine car. That's coming to an end, and so we will need to revolutionise how do we tax transport. Why don't we start that conversation about how do we do that from a local level, rather than devise a new system and then knock on the door of Treasury saying, could we have a little bit of that? So I think there's plenty of opportunity in in thinking with a mindset of what is the public money available, grant, assets, revenues that accrue from those assets, taxation. How do you use that as a stream of revenue to then really maximise the private investment that can flow from that, as opposed to, one of the reasons I left my last job is it shouldn't have been for me to decide which town A or B got a bus shelter. But, that's where I was. So I decided to do something else. Yeah.
Great. Well, from where you are, and what you've just said suggests, of course, a new way of working with the private sector to leverage in further money to work in partnership. How do you see cities orientating themselves towards private sector disciplines, and how do you see them doing that effectively to improve local productivity and increase investment in innovation?
So I think there's sort of two dimensions to that in my mind. There's firstly a kind of trying to have a realistic but ambitious view of where is the growth going to come from, and in a kind of, what are we going to make and what are we going to sell? And the thing that I find challenging is mostly the things we make and sell are intangible assets and services, and that's hard to explain. Politicians love a good narrative. The reason national ministers obsess about the car industry is they understand what the car industry is. They probably remember their geography, the GCSE thing, where they were told about just-in-time production in Japan. And there's an element of simplicity about how the car industry works. Actually, most of our growth, most of our potential is much more effusive, much more difficult to grapple. It kind of comes from companies with 3-letter acronyms that you don't know what they are. I looked at the attendance list for this conference and I scanned down the companies and I realized I didn't know most of them. But there is kind of real potential and real opportunity. So it's how do you kind of bridge that gap of understanding and knowledge and complexity that isn't a reductive sense of we're only good at life sciences. Firstly, I don't know what that means, but certainly it's a kind of pretty simplistic view of the UK's economic strengths. I think then the second point is how to create that trust and that common language between the private investment and the financial services sector and the public sector. It's a realization that it kind of feels a little bit at the moment like we're at a school disco, where you've kind of got the boys on one side of the hall and the girls on the other side of the hall, and they kind of want to have a little dance in the middle, but until someone plays the DJ role, they'll just sort of stand and do some knee slides, and so actually, I think how do you bridge that gap in a way that what is that common language about, and what's the capability to be able to have that right sort of engagement and design the right balance of risk and avoid people just saying, oh, well, that smells a bit like PFI and running for the hills. And so I think there's something about a maturity of conversation and a kind of recognition that, a trust from both sides of that to be able to create those long-term partnerships.
Yeah, and thank you. And you said right at the beginning of that, you mentioned the importance of strong leadership. So I want to turn back to Susan and ask you, from your experience leading the city of Glasgow, as well as the national leadership roles that you've played within Scottish Cities Alliance, for example, or Core Cities, and indeed 3CI, what do you think are the leadership qualities needed at local level to make a change here?
So I think Stephen's touched on a few of them really well already. So collaboration and a willingness to be collaborative and to be open-minded in those collaborations is absolutely crucial. We are not going to deliver this on our own. And this is perhaps particularly relevant in Scotland, where we still have very much a culture, or have had anyway, up until very, very recently, where we have talked about major infrastructure projects like the Queensferry crossing over the River Forth, for example, or the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow as having been built and delivered by the public sector and public money. And it was a real kind of reaction against PFIs and that era. But we need to move into a new era again, not recreating PFIs, and I don't think anybody wants to do that. I don't think either side of the equation, public or private, wants to go back to that era, but also recognising that it isn't a case of this has been done by the private sector and this has been done by the public sector. It needs to be based on genuine collaboration, and there needs to be open-mindedness from public sector leaders, and I think that bit about getting folk to dance at the disco, the convening power of democratically elected local leadership is the key to making that happen. And therefore, that local leadership needs to be needs to be open-minded. And to bring as many people onto that dance floor as possible. So it's public sector, it's academia, your local universities and learning institutions, it's civil society as well is incredibly important, and communities, because if our communities are sidelined, we're not listening to them, we're not responding to their needs, then this will fail. It's not going to have the effect that we want. So we need to be open-minded. We need to be working to find common values and common outcomes that we're all signed up to delivering collectively, rather than saying, I need your money to deliver what I want to get for my citizens and my communities. In actual fact, we should be able to, in the space of decarbonisation and net zero, for example, we should all be able to align around objectives that we want to collectively deliver and get ourselves into the right space where we bring each of our capacities and expertise and assets to the table to maximise impact. So open-minded collaboration, but yeah, an ability to deal with complexity as well. This is incredibly complex. You need to be able to think how investment in cutting-edge, innovative industries, the space sector in Glasgow, for example, how is that connecting? And if it's not, how do you make it connect back to the young person who's about to leave school, who comes from a background of generational worklessness, from whose grandfather lost their job in the post-industrial era, and there has never been anything other than insecure work in the family since. How do we make the difference with that high-tech innovation investment for those people in those communities? That is complex, and there's a lot of steps and a lot of different elements that come into making that work, but that needs to happen. We need to think about every single pound of investment, regardless of where it's coming from, needs to function on multiple levels. It needs to deliver that growth potential, it needs to improve productivity, it also needs to directly address inequalities, and whether that's in health or in skills or in opportunities, because the growth potential and the productivity isn't going to happen unless we're addressing the inequalities as well. So that complexity is incredibly important, and understanding the complexity in local economies as well. Stephen was making the point about this kind of need to grasp onto this is the USP of our local economy. This is what we do. I've been trying to frame what we do, our USP in the Glasgow City region as complexity. That complexity and doing lots of different things is actually what we do well. We're really missing a trick, I think, with the way that investment zones are being taken forward. I'm delighted that Glasgow was designated as one of Scotland's 2 investment zones. We're a wee bit further down the road in the implementation of these in Scotland, because the 2 governments, both national and supranational, came together on that, which is a very good thing. But both of them are going down the line, and I think this is what has happened elsewhere in the UK, of saying essentially, you're going to do advanced manufacturing, you're going to do life sciences, you're going to do creative industries. Well, no, we need to be bringing, and we're under pressure to do that in Glasgow as well, which we're trying to resist, to say, actually, can we do some of all of these things? Because actually the cross-pollination and the ecosystems that all of these different sectors create are how we deliver the economic transformation and how we deliver productivity. I have a colleague on the Glasgow Economic Leadership Board, which I co-chair, Janice Kirkpatrick, who's the founder of a very well-known design company in Scotland, Graven Images, and she says all the time to the principal of University of Strathclyde, which is one of our great engineering universities, if you want to produce an apple, they're having great spin-outs, great commercialisation coming out of their Glasgow City Innovation District. She's saying if you want a future Apple, for example, to come out of the City Innovation District, you need design in there, as well as engineering and tech expertise. You need that cross-pollination. And so I'm concerned that that exact narrative that Stephen talked about, I've gone.
Yes, because it's nearly on zero.
That's how, apologies, I've talked too long. So I'm concerned we're losing that. And I think just the very last point that I was going to make about the qualities that you need to have as a leader is actually a willingness to be unpopular and make some hard decisions which are really challenging some of the kind of culture war narrative that's around just now, because some of the things that are being framed as supposedly for the elites, whether that's investment in net zero, for example, it actually it is our poorest and most deprived communities and places that need that investment most of all, and need it to work on that multiple levels to address the long-standing inequalities that they've suffered from.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to those who put in questions that I haven't been able to do justice to. This has been a great panel. I think you've confirmed you share Andy's optimism for the future of levelling up, but that it's complicated. Yes, they're nodding at me. Well, they are now.
Sorry.
Can we thank this great panel? I think also, Susan, you've made a great case for connected places, but can we thank this great panel? Thank you.